I'm generally very delighted to be here. In no small part, I tend to travel a good deal. For some reason, people seem to want to hear what I have to say from place to place and time to time. And to entertain myself, sometimes I'll pull out the ubiquitous magazine in the back of the airplane seat and check off the number of states I've visited just to see how far I'm getting. And the amazing thing to me is that over all this course of time, I've never been able to check off Texas. I've never been to Texas, and so I'm absolutely delighted to be here. I hope I have the opportunity to actually see a little bit more of Texas, but it's a great honor. If nothing else, I can check off that really big state now. But it truly is a delight to be here, and I'm very grateful to ISI for having me and for you coming out here today. Now, as the first of today's speakers, I feel somewhat obliged to provide for you, in some ways, a roadmap of what I think you may be in store for today. Without knowing for certain what our other speakers are going to say today, and I must say that I have an inkling since I know these two fellows quite well, I think, though, that ISI in its wisdom, and here I think I'm echoing something that Doug said, has sought to provide for you here today not only an understanding of the origins of America, but something of a debate over the origins of America. This will be a debate about one of the most important imaginable subjects, the nature of our nation and its prospects into the future. And this has been, I think, always what ISI has done in the time I've gotten to know it, in roughly over a dozen years, not to indoctrinate or to seek to force students to arrive at a particular understanding, but to make them aware of the great and necessary questions that animate our nation and their deepest sources in the Western tradition and civilization. These questions have never been and perhaps cannot be entirely settled, but they do involve a specific set of issues that must be confronted and that too often on today's college campuses are regarded as either uninteresting or as settled in ways that privilege contemporary campus orthodoxies. Just a few of these questions that we must constantly return to would be, how does one foster ordered liberty? Is it appropriate for a liberal democracy to attempt to shape the character of its citizens? And if so, in what way? And if not, how can it persist in the neglect of the character of its citizenry? What is the role of the relationship of religion to liberal democracy? Can it be shunted into the private realm? Can it be allowed into the public realm? What is the relationship of economic freedom and morality? And can a free market system inculcate the moral commitments and virtues that on the one hand appears to require, but on the other hand in some ways seems to undermine? Over this past dozen years or so of my affiliation with ISI, I've had more conversations about these and related questions than I can count with the students I've met, with its staff, with faculty I've gotten to know through ISI. I think it's fair to say that it has provided for me, and I speak here personally, but I think I'm not alone, it's provided for me the intellectual life that I thought I would be having and enjoying when I began my work as a professor, but which happens all too rarely on today's college campuses. And these conversations have taught me, if not more than what I learned in graduate school, in important ways differently than those things I learned. For me, then, no less than our students today, what one is supposed to be learning is always in some ways confused with the more utilitarian reasons that often impel one to attend university today, eventually to get a job and to achieve success in the world. This, of course, is an important and necessary goal, I wouldn't deny it, but it inevitably generates some confusion in the mind, always potentially downgrading the experience of learning for the sake of learning, for the sake of knowing. The great advantage of ISI is that there is no confusion involved. It gathers students and faculty together without accompanying tests or expectations that whatever one is doing will have to end up as resume fodder. ISI gathers us together in order to explore, I think as we're doing today, and attempt to understand more deeply the permanent questions, what Russell called the permanent things. So to ISI, I am grateful, more grateful than I can really express. So for those of you today who are going to remain here for the 3 lectures, I think you will witness a debate about some of those permanent things. In particular, you should hear 3 distinct understandings and interpretations of American character and how that character has been fundamentally shaped by our founding and subsequently influenced in ways both good and for ill. We will probably differ somewhat on how much ill and how much good we see around us, and in part that will derive from our understanding of the founding itself and subsequent developments. By the end of the day, you may end up with more questions than answers, but that's actually a big part of what ISI does, to remind us of the centrality of those questions and the importance of confronting them. One issue of debate that I think what you will witness today is over the status and meaning of our Lockean inheritance. John Locke was a philosopher living in the 17th century and is the founder of the philosophy of liberalism. Liberalism is the philosophy that begins with the idea that human institutions must be chosen, that governments exist by the consent of the governed, that it is the nature of human beings to be free, and that our freedom is defined especially by the rights that we retain against the claims of other people and our government. It is the philosophy that informed the Declaration of Independence, and much of the language that Jefferson used in that document came straight out of Locke's writings. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. That, in about 18 words, is the second treatise of government by Locke. Many of these familiar phrases, in fact, derive directly from Locke's philosophy, and it's fair to say that for a long time it has been well accepted and widely understood that the American founding was a deeply Lockean founding, and that America is a deeply liberal nation in that classical sense. Now, one thing that conservatives debate over quite a bit is whether this is entirely true and whether this is entirely a good thing. Can one be a conservative liberal? Or is liberalism always prone to an or even anti-conservative outcome? Locke's philosophy is designed to make us wary or even deeply mistrustful of authority. Right? He's writing against a king. And this is a long-standing tradition in America, of course, even a very conservative one. One must only look at the Tea Party movement. But at the same time, conservatives also claim a special place of pride for authority and the need for deference, civility, and respect. Can one somehow combine an anti-authoritarian philosophy with vibrant forms of respect for authority? Another subject of debate is the Lockean theory of human nature, which holds, like Thomas Hobbes before him, that man is by nature, in the state of nature, free and independent, an autonomous individual, a self-interested, rationally calculating, self-maximizing creature that is driven above all by two basic motivations, fear and desire. In our natural state, that is to say, we are not relational creatures, not defined above all by our obligations and our debts to people such as our parents, our neighbors, our communities, generations that preceded us, and generations that will follow us. In fact, of course, it was Edmund Burke who was responding to the Lockean philosophy when he wrote, "The social contract is not simply between the living, but between the living, the dead, and the not yet born." Conservatism has at once defended the idea of the individual against ideologies of collectivism, but also in many guises it has insisted upon the centrality of more local kinds of devotions, family, community, even country. Doug just mentioned the philosophy of our founding is universal. Well, in the end, the question might be, does the nation even deserve our devotion if it's a universal philosophy? Can a philosophy then based upon a deeply individualistic set of assumptions about human nature resist the tendency over time to work like a solvent on our bonds and our relationships? For instance, one could imagine an outcome in which divorce becomes common, in which community is undermined, and in which inculcates the tendency to treat others and the world in a utilitarian manner. Finally, Lockeanism denies that there can be any good to which the state can be oriented. The state must always prefer the right, by which is meant a neutral set of laws, over the good, providing the space for individuals to pursue their own idea and conception of the good life, and staying out of the business of encouraging one outcome over another. Again, conservatives within the liberal tradition favor the idea, which I think generally, of the state staying out of the business of telling us what we should and should not do, what we should think and what we shouldn't think. But at the same time, this very philosophy proves supportive of relativism, of the worldview that there is no right or wrong, only opinions and preferences. Relativism has been the major source of concern and even condemnation by contemporary conservatives. One must think only back to Alan Bloom's Closing the American Mind. But at the same time, relativism may simply be the expected and inevitable result of the very philosophy at the heart of the American founding. I could go on. In fact, I could spend all day. talking about the complexities and perplexities of our founding. But let me stop at these examples to return to why the debates over the nature of the founding, and here I mean largely among what you would call conservatives, are so central and inescapable. We are often talking here about competing goods, and competing goods that many conservatives hold simultaneously to be desirable. And the question then becomes how much and to what extent are our present ills and goods the consequence of the philosophy of the American founding, and how much can those ills be moderated by appeal either to that philosophy itself or to something beyond that philosophy. If we seem at times to be becoming too collectivist, then we may need to assert the priority of our Lockean founding, and I think that's been much the history of the last 50 years. But if we're becoming too individualist, if the solvent has worked its way to every institution and grouping in our society, if we're no longer respectful of the bonds of family and community, of church and of nation, then we may need to be less Lockean. For many conservatives, properly diagnosing our situation means properly understanding our founding. But because even conservatives differ in their diagnosis of our current understanding and differ in our diagnosis of the founding, we're apt to end in different spots. Alexis de Tocqueville, whom I will be speaking about, the French aristocratic author of the great book, Democracy in America, in some senses summarizes best why these debates are so necessary and so inescapable. In the second chapter of this masterpiece, called On the Point of Departure, he writes that to understand both individual humans and nations, it's necessary first to go back to their point of origin and see the nature of the seed from which the full organism sprung. Let me quote just a bit from Tocqueville. He writes, "Go back. Examine the infant even in the arms of his mother. See the external world reflected for the first time in the still obscure mirror of his intelligence. Contemplate the first examples that strike his eye. Listen to the first words that awaken the sleeping powers of his thought. Finally, attend to the first struggles he has to sustain, and only then will you understand where the prejudices, the habits, the passions that will dominate his life, where they came from. The man is, so to speak, a hole in the swaddling clothes of his cradle." I'm the father of a teenage son now, and my wife and I constantly say, we should have known exactly how he was going to turn out based on how he acted when we changed his diaper. Tocqueville goes on, something analogous takes place in nations. People always feel the effects of their origins. The circumstances that accompanied their birth serve to develop them and influence the entire course of the rest of their lives. Tocqueville then at this point turns to an examination of the origin of America's character, looking at our youth, at our founding, at our childhood, in order to discern the true nature of the nation. And what he finds there, in light of everything I've just said, proves to be utterly surprising. It's always been understood as something of a scandal that Tocqueville, the most admired, maybe the only admired Frenchman in America today, did not in that massive work, big book, even once mention the Declaration of Independence, much less point it out as the founding document containing the founding philosophy of America. Through this rather glaring omission, Tocqueville suggested to his readers that America was not fundamentally to be understood as a natural rights republic, that is, a nation that was founded in the light of the modern liberal philosophy of John Locke. We are not a nation understandable by appeal to our natural rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It's perhaps even more of a scandal that Tocqueville argued that the American character took its cue from a very different founding, one that few today would celebrate, much less even acknowledge. We used to have to do it unbeknownst to us every morning in Miss Baylow's kindergarten class. My country 'tis of thee, sweet land of liberty of thee I sing, land of the Pilgrim's pride. I was an Irish Catholic boy. Still, I was acknowledging land of the Pilgrim's pride. In other words, the inauguration of the national character by the Puritan settlers of our forebears. One would be hard-pressed to find anyone today declaring allegiance to the Puritanism of our forebears. If anything, the story that Americans have told ourselves over ensuing years, at least when it comes to the Puritans, is that it took decades and even centuries, but finally Americans overthrew that Puritanism of our founding. If anything, the story that the story that we tell is that if we think of Puritanism at all, it's generally to deny that it has anything to do with who we are as a people. If anyone considers us to be Puritan anymore, it's the French. And unlike Tocqueville, that's not meant as a compliment. Not long ago, European nations looked disapprovingly upon the congressional impeachment and prosecution of President Clinton as evidence of our residual Puritanism. And most Americans, to the extent that we were inclined to respond at all, denied that our Puritan roots had anything to do with it. What Tocqueville once found to be profoundly admirable about the American character, his French countrymen today are likely to find to be altogether damnable, and Americans themselves are likely vehemently to deny to be the case. And of course, we all understand at a certain level why this would be so. Today, the word Puritanism has been reduced to one meaning. It has come to mean sexual repression, whether enforced by oppressive laws or internal forms of self-repression. To be a Puritan is to be someone who's worried that somewhere someone might be having fun, particularly of the sexual nature. I assigned these readings from Tocqueville just this semester to my students and asked them to write a paper about it, and every one of them wrote that Tocqueville admires people who are puritanical, not simply Puritan, but puritanical. This is a term of art meant to invoke an irrational effort to suppress human joy and satisfaction. It can be little wonder that the term is now regarded by the French and Americans alike as an insult, a label to be vehemently denied, even while insisting upon the embrace of a more progressive disposition that has led us beyond those antiquated hang-ups. Everyone, left, right, middle, or otherwise, prefers to affiliate the American spirit with the sentiments of the Declaration, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, rather than in any way suggesting that we are or ought to be a Puritan or puritanical nation. But in affixing the American character to our Puritan origins, Tocqueville, of course, wasn't suggesting this was an insult, or even that it should be understood as narrowly as we would typically tend to understand that term today. What he was suggesting is the answer that, in some ways, that we would need to begin to understand why Tocqueville suggests this, is to understand Tocqueville's assessment of Puritanism itself, an assessment he provides for his readers very early in Democracy in America, again in Chapter 2 of the first book, first part of Democracy in America. For Tocqueville, above all, it was the intermingling of Puritan Christianity and subsequent forms of political commitments to what he called democratic and republican theories that provided for him perhaps the distinctive feature of this new American democracy. In America, he saw and admired what he wrote of a combination of the spirit of religion and the spirit of freedom, a blending of the mores of Christian and republican theory that was unique to the New World. He much admired this combination and commended it for the consideration of his European readers, where too often established religions served the ends of oppressive monarchies, of feudalism, and the condition of unfreedom. Yet Tocqueville here was also expressing a distinctive idea of freedom, one that will strike many contemporary readers as odd and unfamiliar, and my students have really a hard time getting their brains around it, which he appeared to derive in considerable part from his extensive reading of Puritan authors. In particular, during the chapter, he quotes from one of the major Puritan works of early America entitled Magnalia Christi Americana, or the Ecclesiastical History of New England, written by Cotton Mather in 1820. And this is the citation provided by Tocqueville, citing Mather, in what he calls, and this is Tocqueville's words, a beautiful definition of liberty. So now I'm quoting Tocqueville, quoting Mather. Quote, Mather, nor would I have you mistake in the point of your liberty. There is a liberty of corrupt nature which is affected by men and beasts to do what they list, what they will. And this liberty is impatient with authority, impatient of all restraint. By this liberty, somus omnes deteriores, we are inferior. 'Tis the grand enemy of truth and peace, and all the ordinances of God are bent against it. But there is a civil, a moral, a federal liberty, which is the proper end and an object of authority. It is a liberty for that only which is just and good. For this liberty you are to stand with the hazard of your own lives. End quote. Tocqueville then is here approvingly citing a distinction that we can trace back to classical antiquity between a liberty understood as license, doing as one likes, and liberty understood as ordered, that is, free choice made on behalf of the good. Right choice. It is an old Greek and Christian notion of doing what is consonant with the good, not the Lockean understanding of liberty of doing whatever one likes within a fairly wide scope of freedom provided by the liberal state. This form of liberty, as the Mather citation suggests, is consistent with authority that now attempts to order society so that citizens are encouraged to make those decisions and undertake actions that are oriented toward the just and good, to quote Mather again. Liberty, thus understood, what Mather calls civil, moral, and federal liberty, is not defined in the absence of restraint or the domain of open choice driven by personal preference, but instead as a condition of self-government. It is thus at once civil and moral, because it demands mutually reinforcing self-governance, both at the level of society, particularly through the majesty of law, as well as individual morality through the cultivation of virtue, and in particular, of course, for the Puritans, Christian virtue. The orientation of the Puritan, then, was not toward the individual and the satiation of the self, but toward the community and the demands of commonweal, above all that community of fellow pilgrims in the context of the township, that is, the small, the personal, and the local. But it must also be noted that this local orientation was itself understood to point to a higher good than the community itself, toward the good of the created order, as was ordained by the divine creator. There is perhaps no better explication of this orientation. Oops, sorry. A little more water. Just use a napkin, sorry. That's right. Oh, good. There is perhaps no better explication of this orientation than that of the first governor of Massachusetts Bay Colony, John Winthrop, whose speech aboard the ship carrying the Pilgrims to America has become a justly famous expression of the Puritan social and political view. Entitled A Model of Christian Charity, Winthrop explicated to his fellow pilgrims the kind of society that they should aspire to build upon their arrival in the New World. He began his speech with an acknowledgement of the apparent permanent inequalities of condition and station that he says has always been the hallmark of human society, of humanity itself. He writes, quote, "God Almighty in his holy and wise providence hath so disposed of the condition as in all times some must be rich, some poor, some high and eminent in power and dignity, others mean and in subjection." Imagine a governor today opening a speech with that statement. Winthrop's point, though, is not that the evident manifestations of difference or even inequality of wealth or talent should be the source of lamentation and indignation, or alternatively self-congratulation or self-satisfaction, which would be the likely responses if viewed from the respective perspective of the individuals comparing their respective conditions. You have what I don't have, or I have what you want. Instead, he argues, we need to understand our differences altogether as gifts of God, in particular as manifestations of the ways of our own insufficiency and our partiality and of our mutual reliance. God creates humans differently, he writes, quote, so that every man might have need of the others, and from hence they might be knit more nearly together in bonds of brotherly affection. From hence it appears plainly that no man is made more honorable than any other, or more wealthy, etc., out of any particular or singular respect to himself, but for the glory of his Creator and the common good of the creature, man. That's Winthrop. Our differences, then, are actually signs of a deeper equality, the standing call to consider the ways that our different gifts are to be employed for the benefit of the whole. Neither are the wealthy to be feel to be self-satisfied by their fortune, but nor are the poor to harbor resentment and envy. Rather, all distinctions are ultimately to be understood as distinctive parts of a larger whole, a part of a created order, and for God's glory alone. Every person, however situated, is called to contribute their share to the common weal. While justice is a necessary aspiration, it is insufficient. Our primary duty is to emulate the love of Christ, that gratuitous form of charity. Right? Remember, the speech is a model of Christian charity that is freely given for the benefit of others. And thus writes Winthrop in one of his most majestically rhetorical passages, quote, "We must be knit together for this work of one man. We must entertain each other in brotherly affection. We must be willing to abridge ourselves of our superfluities for the supply of others' necessities. We must uphold a familiar commerce with together in all meekness, gentleness, patience, and liberality. We must delight with each other. We must make others' conditions our own, rejoice together, mourn together, labor, and suffer together, always having before our eyes our commission and community in the work, our communities as members of the same body." Only in the setting of a strong and mutually reinforcing community life, actuated by ongoing and constant practice of caring for and investment in the good of the whole, can the temptation toward the debased form of liberty, doing as one lists, based upon the preference of individuals, be moderated and schooled. What is to take place at the level of individual inculcation through informal schooling of family, church, and community is to be reinforced through the political community as well. Winthrop thus writes that a people must be governed, quote, under a due form of government, in which, quote, the care of the public must oversway all private respects by which not only conscience but mere civil polity doth bind us. For it is a true rule that particular estates cannot subsist in the ruin of the public. So the entire orientation of Puritan society was toward the good of the community, a lived experience that was ultimately to reflect and emulate the love of God for the people. Such freedom was finally, to return to Tocqueville's citation of Mather, not inconsistent with authority, but given its basis in a decisive conception of the good, required authoritative laws and mores that directed the life of individuals and the community at large toward the governance of the self and of the community. Now, in our own day, we have come to understand Puritanism solely as a form of sexual repressiveness, since that is increasingly the only salient way that modern people can conceive of ultimate liberation. Do whatever you want. What has been lost is the broader and deeper teaching of Puritans about ordered liberty, a liberty attained through the ongoing practice of self-rule oriented at commonweal through a created order in which the choice of the just and the good was finally the only true choice. This was the understanding of liberty that Tocqueville argued was at the heart of the American character. Now, in what respect, then, traveling in America in the 1830s, did Tocqueville see this or understand that this was, right, the child of America in its infancy? In what way could he have reached this conclusion? Well, what he relates, if one reads Tocqueville, is having witnessed during his travels a rather extraordinary high levels and forms of political activity, a devotion to public life that was altogether distinct from what he had ever experienced as a French aristocrat. In particular, he writes of seeing in the practices, especially the New England townships, and the rich associational life, the act of engaging in practical and political activities. He saw in these activities the legacy of America's Puritan founding. He spoke of seeing in America such devotion to acting on behalf of public life, he wrote, that if one were to take away that dimension of an American's life, it would be as if you had taken away half of their lives. He saw in America a rich associational life and the existence and persistence of associations, and he saw in those the very source of a healthy and manly form of liberty. Associations in particular, he wrote, tamed at once the twin tendencies toward individualism and collectivism, at once drawing individuals outside of their narrow interests and populating the nation with intermediary institutions that resisted an encompassing tyranny of the majority. He wrote that citizens engaged in his associational life, that they were, quote, drawn from the midst of their individual interests and from time to time torn away from the sight of themselves. Tocqueville defended the central importance of local freedoms, as he called them, those partial and more immediately palpable goods of community that made engagement more directly possible and which could have the effect of inculcating the arts of association. The arts, he wrote, quote, that bring men closer together to one another despite the instincts that separate them, and which rather force them to aid each other. What Tocqueville saw then was the ongoing inculcation of habits of self-government, the taming of the tendency to withdraw into individual reverie or to express one's political views purely or solely in terms of interest, and instead the fostering of public spiritedness and a sense of patriotism and fellow feeling that derive from local circumstances. He spoke of this as Aristotle would speak of as a kind of habituation or education, not unlike the way in which the Puritans understood. Again, Tocqueville, I quote, one is occupied with the general interest at first by necessity and then by choice. What was calculation becomes instinct, and by dint of working for the good of one's fellow citizens, one finally picks up the habit and taste of serving them, end quote. He called associations the great schools of democracy, inculcating a spirit of healthy democratic self-sacrifice. Through associations, democratic citizens, and I quote, learn to submit their will to that of all the others, very Puritan, and to subordinate their particular efforts to common action. Through associations, he wrote, the heart is enlarged. However, at the same time, Tocqueville was not uncognizant, of course, of the reality of America's official philosophical doctrine, that more individualistic and self-interested claim of its official Lockeanism. He noted a strange fact about Americans. It's almost, you can hear him puzzling this through in this chapter, self-interest rightly understood, that every action they undertake, even those that are clearly motivated by a sense of fellow feeling, altruism, or self-sacrifice, tended to be justified in terms of self-interest. He writes with an almost kind of perplexity over this American propensity, writing, quote, they do not do themselves justice. For sometimes one sees Americans in the United States, as elsewhere, abandoning themselves to the disinterested and unreflective sparks that are natural to men. But the Americans scarcely avow that they yield to movements of this kind. They would rather do more honor to their philosophy than to themselves. What Tocqueville identifies as a kind of gap or lacuna between the official language of Americans and their actions. What he saw was the practical legacy of Puritanism on the ground, the active engagement of self-governing individuals toward the achievement of the common good in conformity with a conception of the good. But what he hears is philosophical Lockeanism, that stated claim in which the philosophy is more honored than the man, than the person, than the actions. He identified a puzzling disjuncture between the word and the deed, and worried whether over time the word would begin to shape the deed, or perhaps whether our actions would begin to conform to our claims. In worried tones, he wrote, quote, one must expect that individual interest will become more than ever the principal and unique motive of men's actions. But it remains to be seen how each man will understand his individual interest. He was a little bit up in the air. He hoped for a kind of enlightened self-interest, what he calls self-interest rightly understood. But he worried that enlightened interest might eventually give way simply to unenlightened interest, and that enlightened interest must in some ways derive from practices that would moderate those interests deriving from individualism itself. Tocqueville argued that there was a complex relationship between what he called mores, or mores, to use the French, customs, practices, traditions. Right? Mores on the one hand, and on the other hand, law. He believed that mores would influence the law over the short term, but in the long term, laws would come to influence mores. In America, in identifying a gap between our mores and our laws, our practice and our official understanding of ourselves, that we were practically Puritan but officially Lockean, Tocqueville found a worrisome gap. Much of what Tocqueville wrote in Democracy in America then was fundamentally a recommendation that Americans should strive to retain and defend the practical manifestations of their Puritan inheritance against their official explanation of those actions. They should encourage and even in whatever way possible support the arts of association and the attendant training and habituation that that mother school provided. They should also retain and strengthen healthy religious devotions and orientations, the one main source of belief in the good that combated the tendency toward relativism and toward materialism. Religion, he argued, had the ability of lengthening and expanding humanity's temporal horizon, as well as our appreciation for the vertical. Right? Democracies tend to be horizontal. Everybody's equal, right? But God's not exactly equal. And so the defense of the vertical in an otherwise horizontal age. Belief in the good and the true beyond the world, God himself, orients or has the possibility of orienting the vision of the democratic citizen toward a good outside of himself, beyond mere interest, and ultimately to norms and standards that lie outside the will of the majority itself. Above all, then, both associational life and religion reject the debased form of liberty to which democracy is inclined, doing as one lists, and instead reinforces the elevated conception of liberty, that civil, moral, and federal liberty which conforms to the just and the good, again to quote Cotton Mather again. What Tocqueville feared was that the logic of modern democracy and its official founding would undermine the associational life and religion that was practiced. He saw in Americans a tendency toward individualism, from the withdrawal away from civic and associational life into what he called the solitude of their own hearts. He feared the dominance of various forms of materialism and restlessness that would orient democratic man's ambitions solely toward the worldly and toward the personal, a kind of inherited Cartesian and Lockean skepticism that would eviscerate belief in anything being objectively true, and instead lead to the conclusion that all beliefs and views are merely the expressions of preference or opinion. He feared, in a word, that we would become what we claimed to be, that our actions would ultimately conform to our philosophy. And it was from this very outcome that he feared that the destiny of democracy itself would ultimately, paradoxically, end democracy. Seeing then in the ravaging and rejection of inherited Puritan practices the rise of a new kind of despotism, what he called democratic despotism. Now, many readers of Tocqueville, particularly conservative ones, even people who haven't read Tocqueville, know one thing about Tocqueville, that he warned against the rise of the centralized bureaucratic tutelary government, that soft despotism of the centralized nanny state. It is these passages of Tocqueville that has always been the most admired, particularly by conservatives. But most readers, and here I think even conservatives, fail to see that Tocqueville understands the rise of the centralized tutelary state not to be the result of a kind of nefarious leftist coup, but rather the consequences of an ever greater tendency to embrace Lockean forms of individualism. Throughout his book, he writes of the ways in which associational life strengthens citizens, gives them the tools and the capacities and talents for finding together the means of achieving the particular good within their communities, and providing for them familiarity with and love for a civic form of freedom. The tendency for democracies over time, he wrote, was towards separation, solipsism, individualism, suspicions toward groups and people that make claims upon us, and the inclination to be more tempted by private than public concerns. And increasingly, of course, understanding freedom to be doing as one wants, not the learned capacity for self-government. It's these conditions that make us ripe for the rise of the tutelary state. Tocqueville over and over again describes such people as weak, shorn of the resources that provide a true avenue toward freedom. And so he writes toward the end of democracy in America in ways that are, I think, even more pessimistic than is commonly understood, that the very claims of that debased form of freedom, the ability to do what one wants or lists, will lead to the most debased form of modern tyranny, the willingness and indeed the embrace of a democratic form of tyranny. Thus Tocqueville writes, I think with profound acute insight, and I quote, "Since no man in such a situation is obliged to lend his force to those like him, and no one has the right to expect great support from those like him, each is at once independent and weak. These two states, which must neither be viewed separately nor confused, give the citizen of democracies very contrary instincts. His independence fills him with confidence and pride among his equals, but his debility makes him feel from time to time the need of the outside help that he cannot expect from any of them, since they are all impotent and cold. In this extremity, he naturally turns his regard to the immense being, the tutelary state, that rises alone in the midst of universal debasement. His needs, and above all his desires, constantly lead him back toward it, and in the end he views it as the unique and necessary support for his individual weakness." Tocqueville's analysis then provides us a unique understanding of the sources of modern centralization and the rise of the administrative state that I think in some ways challenges some of our assumptions. Often we tend to view its rise as the result of a collectivist spirit and assert in its opposition a hale defense of the individual. Tocqueville's analysis suggests that those concerned with the rise of the tutelary state should not be defending individualism necessarily, that we should not assert our Lockeanism, but oddly enough, reach back to an earlier time of our infancy, our Puritan inheritance, and its stress upon liberty achieved through mutual self-governance in the light of the good. And I'm speaking now as a Catholic. Yesterday, I was actually sitting in the airport in Washington on my way before I boarded the flight to Dallas, and I happened to catch an advertisement for the current census. I've seen these advertisements. And I've actually looked it up last night, and I found out since it's called The March to the Mailbox. I don't know if any of you have seen this one. It portrays an ordinary Joe sitting in his couch. He's a couch potato. He's actually wearing a bathrobe. And he gets up. He's filled out his census form, he gets up and marches out of his house past his picket fence front yard, where suddenly the street is filled with friends and neighbors, the names of whom he knows entirely. Everyone. They all have white picket fences. He states that by filling out the census form, he's helping little Pete improve his school and the road for his neighbor's carpool and Rita's health care plan, who's about to have birth apparently right in the middle of the street. And I quote, so that we can get our fair share of federal funding. That's why we need to march to the mailbox. As I watched this commercial, I found myself thinking along precisely Tocquevillian lines, that the very community spirit being portrayed in that commercial would itself obviate the need for that sort of aid. Right? If we actually knew the names of the people around us, and we're so willing to help, we might need not to rely on the federal government. The ad was itself portraying a vibrant community of people willing to help each other. But in fact, the need for the commercial in the first place was born of the widespread absence of any such reality. Thank you.